9. The room was basic, but Rodin had stayed in worse. It had surveillance. Of course, they hadn't even attempted to hide the eyes embedded in the corners, although it did take him longer to uncover 5 others. Rodin left them intact. There seemed little point in trying to hide. After checking the place out, he took a shower, allowing himself to wallow in the harsh downpour of water, first hot enough to redden his skin, then cold enough to burn. He even used the air dry rather than the towel. The people in the dome were fastidious about hygiene and appearance, and so Rodin used the powders and sprays arrayed on the shelves. There were clippers and a file, so Rodin saw to his nails. A tub to one side contained a blue waxy substance that appeared to be hair gel, and Rodin experimented with a little of it. Not that it did much to the shortcut he had. The room contained a storage unit stocked with clothing, nothing like his usual garb. But he'd have to get used to wearing fashion shirts with fancy sleeves and collars, jackets with strange fastenings and false pockets, and shoes that would do nothing to protect his soles from rough terrain or broken glass. Totally impractical, designed to be admired. When he tapped the wall screen to select the mirror setting, it was no longer Rodin who stared back. Terrell. Not the first new identity he'd worn, and as with the others, he knew the secret wasn't in looks alone. To play this part, he needed to understand who this Terrell character was. He woke the handheld screen, pulled up the relevant file, and read about the person he must become. Terrell was in his late 30s, older than Rodin believed himself to be. This made sense, of course, when physical alterations were so commonplace. A face like Rodin's would undoubtedly appear aged. But maybe Terrell's hard life could also account for his weathered looks. Born and raised in Ross, one of the northern domes, his childhood was marred by an independence of thought that led him into petty misdemeanors. Twice he stood before authority, and he was placed under what was referred to as supervision as a child. Terrell was too young for correction itself. Previous times he'd ventured into the dome, Rodin had heard these terms and understood vaguely that authority ran the dome, and that correction was a form of incarceration. The references he'd found to it before stated that correction wasn't punishment, but was a way of helping wayward citizens realize their errors, and so turn themselves into perfect members of society. This didn't fool Rodin, though. Correction was nothing more than a way of controlling the masses. He continued reading about Terrell. The youth buckled down to his studies, and while he had no discernible talent at creative endeavors, he did develop a keen appreciation for art, especially painting and sculpture. Rodin made a mental note to research this area in greater detail. If he was to become Terrell, he'd need to at least bluff his way through artistic conversations with conviction. So Terrell worked hard at his studies. But he still had a rebellious streak, and was in communication with other like-minded souls. This could not be allowed, and authority came down. That was the phrase the reports used, authority came down. It sounded dramatic and exciting, but Rodin knew it would have been subtle, a stranger approaching Terrell and the others, maybe ushering them into a waiting car. There would be no scene, no violence, no insults. The car would drive off, and Terrell would find himself in a comfortable room but cut off from the outside world. Much like the room Rodin found himself in now, he thought. And this brought home a different angle on this contract, one Rodin wasn't too happy about. Normally, he'd receive information on the target, maybe some specific instructions regarding the nature of the removal, but that would be it. He'd conduct his own research. But here, everything was laid out for him. Rodin was being guided, and he couldn't shake the notion that Kat was controlling him. But he couldn't go back. He'd accepted the contract and he'd see it through. Terrell was not considered in need of correction, but was instead given the opportunity to start afresh in a new dome, and there was no way Rodin could avoid the euphemistic nature of that phrase. Traveling between domes was a rarity, something most people never even considered, so Terrell was basically being exiled. And when Terrell arrived in Kern Dome, down in the southwest, he would have felt the judgment of those he met. Oh, they'd be civil enough, this was a dome, so manners would be upheld, but someone traveling from another dome was naturally treated with suspicion. The file stated that he settled well in Kern. He found employment at an art gallery, dealing with acquisitions, Rodin understood this to mean that Terrell was involved with the buying, selling and borrowing of works of art. He ventured out into society, and even became emotionally entangled with a girl called Yvonne. There were files on her, attractive without being anything out of the ordinary, could trace her lineage back to Councillor Geraldo, who was apparently considered a great man, had a solid future ahead of her in what was referred to as guided therapy. This, as far as Rodin could make out, was some mumbo-jumbo about talking to make things better, which sounded about right for the dome. Rodin read on, knowing this happiness in Terrell's life couldn't continue. Sure enough, about a year into his time in Kern, Terrell's life was turned upside down once more. He acquired many pieces for the gallery, and Rodin had to remind himself that acquire, in the terminology of the dome, did not automatically imply anything underhand. But some of the pieces turned out to be fakes, and although there was no indication that Terrell was aiming to mislead, in fact, the reports made it clear that he was as much a victim as anyone. It painted a stain on his career and he requested transfer. With his previous record taken into account, transfer was granted, and the poor man now prepared to move to the first dome. Fake artworks. That must have been a major incident within a dome, and Rodin dug deeper into the files. There were official-looking documents concerning the matter, news reports that struggled to disguise shock and disbelief beneath cold language, and opinion pieces that questioned how people could even contemplate such a fraud. Names were rarely mentioned though, and Terrell's did not appear. There were a few reports labeled case notes that had smaller print reading not for general consumption, and these did mention names along with many other details. In at least 3 of these reports Terrell's name appeared. This was unsettling, but Rodin wasn't sure why. He put the screen down and rubbed his eyes. Too much reading was starting a headache, and he knew he needed a break. He exercised if he couldn't work his mind and he didn't feel tired, then he'd work his body. He stripped. There was something about exercising naked that was particularly invigorating, and to hell with the eyes, then ran through his usual routines. As sweat coated his body, and as he focused on the pull and release of muscles and tendons, his mind ran free. It kicked the issue of Terrell's name around, and slowly Rodin grew to understand why things felt off. Terrell was an assumed identity. The man wouldn't exist until Rodin stepped into his shoes when he entered the dome. This meant that the records were false, nothing more than fictions to help Rodin play his part. But the reports on the art forgeries looked official. And that meant one of 2 things: the reports could, ironically, be excellent forgeries, or Terrell's name could have been added to help Rodin's cover. That felt like too much work as well as being too risky. There was always a chance of discovery unless every single record had been altered, both in First Dome and elsewhere. Rodin couldn't see anyone going to such extremes. Which left one more option: that Terrell was a real person. Maybe a troubled young man, caught up in this art fraud, was even now preparing to leave Kern Dome. Maybe he'd board one of the few trains that traveled between the domes, through the tunnels and the concrete tubes that stuck out from the glass structures. Maybe he'd have his own carriage, somewhere secluded. But he'd never arrive. When the train pulled up in this dome, his carriage would be empty. Of course, the dome would never do such a thing, at least, not officially. But wasn't Rodin being pulled in to do something similar? Wasn't the fact that there was this strange halfway house, an unofficially official gateway to the dome, an indication that things were not as they appeared? Maybe this contract would provide more interest than Rodin first thought. Days passed. Although with no window and no clock, Rodin had to trust the appearances of Kat to gauge how many. The man would send an alert to the wall screen, then turn up a few minutes later. He said he did this twice a day, and that felt about right. The first visit, Kat asked about his childhood. Not Rodin's but Terrell's. And this was easy to talk about. After reading Terrell's history, Rodin had already created false memories: the time he had fallen in a river when a tree branch snapped, how he had sworn off alcohol after his first evening's serious drinking, the time his parents had woken earlier than normal and discovered the girl in his bed, and how they both responded so differently. Maybe this was easy to do, because Rodin had no childhood memories of his own. For 10 years he'd been a mercenary, slowly developing his skills, gaining scars as he learnt from his mistakes. And before Before his very first paid job there had been 2 years walking the districts doing whatever he could to survive. He could recall being hungry and scared, surrounded by cold grey buildings with cracks in the walls. At times he thought he had once walked through a forest, big enough that he lost sight of any buildings. But before that time, there was nothing.
It's pleasing to hear you embellishing the basic facts,
Cat said, although there was no sign of pleasure on his face.
but tell me something of the dome. What do you know of the council?
Rodin shrugged. It runs the place. As far as I can tell, lots of people making pathetic decisions on unimportant matters. But that seems to keep the people happy. Cat shook his head.
That won't do at all. I wish to talk to Mr. Terrell, not some thug who can barely string 2 words together. Let's try again. What do you know of the council?
As frustrating as Cat's attitude was, Rodin understood. If he was to pass himself as a resident of the dome, he had to become Terrell almost unconsciously. He took a breath, recalled what he'd read of the council and talked. The first dome rose from Horace Devon's Dominion, and that was founded on 4 principles, ideals the society would strive for. He wanted security for his citizens to exist in peace with their neighbors, freedom from violence and oppression, comfort in having all their physical, intellectual, spiritual and emotional needs met without struggle, and opportunities to develop in all areas without censure. Rodin waved his arms, punctuating this recitation. These principles still hold firm today, and they form the basic ideology behind the 4 branches of the Dome's Council, he continued, speaking slowly so that he could plan his words. One section focuses on security, with authorities seeking to keep individuals safe from themselves, as well as other groups looking after the physical structure of the dome itself. There is another section that offers freedom from oppression, through providing a voice for members of society, via open meetings and friendly one-on-one discussions, the living embodiment of the notion that open dialogue will always defeat tyranny. A third section concerns itself with comfort through not only mediating in disputes, but also through attempting to prevent any such issues arising. And finally, there is the section involving the wide range of cultural and sporting activities the residents might enjoy, thereby providing opportunities for each individual to develop. Not the best speech, and Rodin wasn't sure if he'd explained things clearly, but at least the answer was verbose enough. Cat must have thought so too as he nodded, and his cheeks twitched as if he were about to smile.
Very good,
he said.
A fine attempt to dilute a complicated matter into something succinct. But let us move on. I take it you've read of the position of employment awaiting Mr. Terrell, correct?
Rodin nodded. He, or rather Terrell, would be working for and living with an artist named Sergio, something of a celebrity within the dome. Apparently his fame, and the pieces he created, had spread to other domes too. His earlier works were in paint, but now he focused on sculpture.
What are your initial impressions of the man?
Cat asked, and Rodin answered after a few moments, collecting his thoughts. I think he carries his art into his personal life, Rodin said. Where so many others have alterations to achieve a healthy young impression, he opts for a size approaching obesity, yet he uses his mass to make a statement to be larger than life. That sounded like bad poetry, but Rodin continued. His lack of hair can be understood as a symbol of his openness. He is honest in his art, and he has nothing to hide as an artist.
An intriguing assessment, Mr. Terrell, although possibly you're reading too much into things. I believe it more likely he simply finds comfort in being hairless. But what of his public persona?
The word avuncular comes to mind. He's gregarious, well-respected, enjoys the company of others, but at the same time he is also secretive about his work. I notice that while he might hint at his current project, he gives nothing away until it is unveiled. I would also add that from watching some of the unveiling videos, he encourages others to praise him through mock self-depreciation.
An astute observation, and one that calls for elaboration.
It didn't, because the look on Cat's face told Rodin the man understood, but Rodin had to play the game. In each of his unveiling speeches, he talks of the troubles creating the finished piece, and then he lists what he sees as its shortcomings. His tone is apologetic, and he promises that his next project will rectify these faults. He shrugged. I can't say I find such false modesty attractive. Cat nodded, but said nothing more on the matter. Instead, he asked what Rodin thought of the man's work. The pieces, when Rodin studied the files, were surprisingly violent. They focused on the human body, but limbs were deformed and broken, sometimes missing altogether. Flesh was ripped and bloody, and on the few occasions Sergio focused on faces, expressions were tortured, the pain as much emotional and mental as physical. They seemed to fly in the face of the dome's non-violent nature, and Rodin was at a loss to explain what he thought. Rodin compared them to other pieces he'd studied, Anatov's Chard, with those black and twisted figures sprouting vivid green shoots, or Bawani's Reversal, where the flickering monochrome images flashed up faces etched in agony. Then there was the Sanam sequence of performance body art pieces by Lilithong, and the way they blurred the line between cries of sexual ecstasy and screams of pain. Of course, there were the comments from critics and reviewers, and Rodin repeated these words to Cat. The man nodded, but his expression remained impassive.
Very good,
he said when Rodin had finished.
But I asked what you thought of Sergio's work, not the waffling of self-important journalists whose primary motivation is the next free lunch. Tell me what you think.
Rodin snorted. It's art. Frivolous and unimportant. Cat leaned back.
And that is the response of the enthusiastic art lover, Mr. Terrell, is it? Please try again.
Rodin clenched and unclenched his fist, annoyed more at his inattention than at Cat's condescending attitude. I believe I already gave that answer. In my former role in the art world, my own thoughts were immaterial. I said what was required to buy any particular piece for the best price possible, and I took my cues from those more adept at understanding art. He too sat back, pleased at his performance.
Not bad,
Cat said.
But that was too confrontational. And I believe you will need to ponder this matter in some depth. Art is more important than you realize.
Then he raised his hands, and a cold smile spread on his lips, never reaching his eyes.
But on to other matters. Tell me about the target.
Rodin took a breath. This was the kind of work he was comfortable with. Councillor Leopold. 32, impressive academic record, works in the section of the council tasked with listening to residents. One of the youngest councillors to rise to Tier 4. Many name him as a potential leader of the council. In error, obviously.
As long as you succeed in removing him. What else?
Patron of the arts, wide social circle, lives alone but has been romantically linked to various others, both female and male. Physically active, enjoys running and sailing especially. Liked by many, but starting to ruffle feathers. Seems to speak ideas others find off-putting.
And there is a reason why you mention this.
The contract states that his removal must look natural, which will likely involve getting close to the target. This will be easier to achieve if I build up some kind of rapport, some kind of trust. Aligning myself with his worldview seems like a good place to start.
You seek to befriend the man.
I don't have friends. If Terrell befriends Leopold, it is so that I can fulfill the contract as instructed. The corners of Cat's mouth turned up.
And here I was thinking that Mr. Terrell had taken over. It's most pleasing to know that Mr. Rodin has not forsaken us.
You don't get rid of me that easily. But the comment felt too light-hearted, and although Cat still smiled, the coldness had returned to his eyes. Rodin held the man's gaze, and he once more wondered what he'd got himself into. Jimny's words, a good friend and a dangerous enemy. Rodin still had no clue which Cat was.